There's no movie that looks quite like Wong Kar Wai's 1995 film, Fallen Angels. While the movie is well known for its intimate, kinetic visual style, the most unique aspect of the movie's cinematography is one that's often overlooked, and that's its lens choice, an element which, it turns out, is surrounded by so much mystery that I think I might be the first person to ever actually get to the bottom of it. When it comes to lenses, the focal lengths a cinematographer chooses have a huge impact on the final film, both visually and in what those visuals convey to the audience. Expressed in millimeters, focal length is the way in which lenses are categorized along a sliding scale of perspectives, determining basically how a lens sees things. To give you a little bit of context, on 35mm cameras, lenses in the 35 to 50mm range are right in the center of that spectrum. These are what we call normal lenses, and perceive space and distance roughly similar to that of the human eye, and as a result, feel fairly neutral to us. Going up in focal length, past 60mm, we start to get into telephoto lenses, which make things appear closer than they are in compressed space, often used for isolating subjects and showing detail. On the lower end, below 28mm, are wide lenses. The wider your wides get, the wider the cone of vision or field of view the lens has, and the further away things feel from the camera, making them great for things like landscapes and playing with perspective. For Fallen Angels, cinematographer Christopher Doyle chose to shoot the vast majority of shots on an ultra-wide-angle lens. Ultra-wides take in nearly everything, making environments feel huge, exaggerating distance, and up close, making portraits feel warped and intensely personal, having to be mere inches away from the subject to actually fill the frame.
On the first day of shootings, we work in a very small tea house. The only way we can do is to shoot with a wide-angle lens. But I think we should do something more interesting, so I asked Chris, do we have an extremely wide-angle lens? He said, yes.
It's about space. We use a wide angle because these people are so close together but so distant, and the camera should be close to them, therefore you feel very close to them, but you know that they're really separated by a great distance of, incomprehensibility. They can't talk to each other. That's after the fact. I mean, the real fact is, it was a small space and we had to get close, right? And then you start going in that direction and you say, hey, it's working, this is interesting. And then you try and put on another lens and you say, shit, anything else doesn't work.
These effects are a critical part to the film's unique, exaggerated style, and even now, the specific ultra-wide they used stands out from others like it. Aside from its massive field of view, the lens was soft and dreamy and distortion-free, and sensitive enough to shoot at night with little additional lighting on the streets of Hong Kong. The uniqueness of the lens has made it something I'd been curious to learn more about for a long time, but there was just one problem. Nobody seems to know what it was. No matter where I looked, I couldn't find a single example of someone definitively identifying which lens Doyle had used to shoot the film, even all these years later. So, I decided to find out for myself. I started the only place that I could think to start, digging through forum posts and random film blogs that happened to mention the lens usage in the film, looking for any sort of reported make or focal length that I could go off of. What I found was a lot of rumor and conjecture, but some consistencies did start to emerge. The posts I found all seemed to cite an unnamed 6.5mm ultra-wide lens. Even now, that's an outrageously wide lens, with even the most advanced and expensive modern ultra-wide cinema lenses topping out at around 8mm. That may not sound like a lot, but as focal lengths get smaller, the greater the difference between them becomes, so at this level, even that measly 1.5mm could make a huge difference in what the lens sees. The source of that 6.5mm figure seemed to come from a quote given at some point by Christopher Doyle, but not a single one of the posts listed exactly where it had come from or substantiated it in any way. For all I knew, it might not have even been a real quote. But it was a lead, so I resolved to figure out exactly where the quote had come from, in hopes that in some way it would lead me to what I was looking for. One of the first places I was able to find Doyle's quote in the original context was a mostly ignored Reddit post on the R Cinematography board, also trying to identify the lens. The quote is cited as from an interview with Chris Doyle and reads, "When we did Fallen Angels, I started with a 9.8mm lens. I thought that was rather distorted, but Wong Kar Wai said, let's go further. So we went to a 6.5mm. Michelle Reese turned her head and her nose became like Pinocchio, just extended through the whole frame. I said, what are we gonna do? And Wong Kar Wai said, we don't show her the rushes, do we? However, the quote seems to have been first posted on and subsequently quoted from the cinematography.com forums all the way back in 2004. Though it also matched the number of the focal length I'd seen most referenced, it was the only other discussion thread online I could find citing the quote in its entirety, but still with no more sourcing than simply from an interview with Chris Doyle. Even if the quote had some truth to it, there was no way I could be sure until I could confirm against the primary source that it had been accurately transcribed or even existed at all. Putting the full quote into Google frustratingly turned up nothing but the 2 forum posts I'd already found, but cutting it down to its less cited back half, one more result slipped in: a scanned archive of a 1996 issue of Australian film magazine Cinema Papers, featuring an interview with Christopher Doyle and the original quote in its full context. Unfortunately, the quote in context was still frustratingly lacking in further information. Aside from that one-off line, the lens is never mentioned again. No models are listed, no distinctive characteristics, nothing that I could even start with for IDing the lens. I went back again trying to find any other primary sources online mentioning the 6.5mm lens for any sort of clarification, with no luck. Aside from the post citing back to it, this interview seemed to be the one and only source of that number, and the further I dug, the less certain I became that this lens was even the one that I was looking for. I'd already tried and failed to dig up 6.5mm cinema lenses on my own, but in a few of the forum posts mentioning the interview, I'd remembered seeing a few people confidently suggesting that rather than one of the more popular Cinelens makes, it was in fact referring to a quote Cine Nikkor 6.5mm f1.8. That made sense on its face. The focal lengths matched, and the very fast f-stop or light sensitivity would have allowed them that level of low light shooting featured in the film. But it seems as though I'm the only one who has ever even thought to look deeper into this, because on any investigation, the whole suggestion seemed to fall apart. For starters, the Cine Nikkor 6.5mm isn't even a single lens. It was first introduced as an 8mm camera lens back in the 50s, where, on the smaller film format, it would have looked closer to a mid-wide than the touted mega-ultra-wide of Fallen Angels. A later version was developed for the popular ARRI mount that looked much closer to what I was looking for, serving as an ultra-wide option for film and television cameras, with one problem. It was a lens made for 16mm size film, a whole half size smaller than Fallen Angel's 35mm film stock. Even if Doyle had found one of these lenses and jury-rigged it to his 35mm camera, it would have created a huge black vignette around the entire image, making it completely unusable and obviously not what we see in the film's final photography. I had to face the facts. There was no way this was the lens. With no remaining alternatives, all I was left with was 2 equally defeating possibilities. Either Doyle had misspoke in the interview, or the focal length had simply been a misprint. Regardless, it was a dead end. However, reviewing the previous posts I'd originally gone off of, I found a surprising lead in a stray comment by another working cinematographer mentioning a second possibility, the Kinoptik 9.8mm lens. The Kinoptik 9.8mm ultra-wide lens is a classic in the industry, famously used by Stanley Kubrick in A Clockwork Orange and in The Shining, where it featured in the film's finale maze sequence. Over the years, a number of other films have made use of the lens's extreme angle and wide f1.8 aperture for shooting in small, challenging environments where additional light was scarce. Originally released as a stills photo lens with no manual focus ability, many were eventually rehoused by the company Century Optics for cinema use, transferring the inside of the lens into new, more ergonomic bodies and adding a focus ring, which made the lens more usable and more desirable for filmmaking. The lens's distinct organic rendering and its regular availability would have made it an obvious choice for Doyle when looking for an ultra-wide to fit their vision for the look of Fallen Angels. Looking back at the interview quote from Doyle, he also referred to a 9.8mm lens, and from there, narrowing the search from a seemingly non-existent 6.5mm lens to the much more plausible 9.8 finally gave me the breakthrough that I needed. With these new search terms, my first hit was a college thesis on Wong Kar Wai, with only a single mention of focal length in a section discussing Fallen Angels, specifically claiming that a 9.8mm lens was used, citing a 2005 book by Stephen Teo. While I was unable to easily track down that book, another book by the same author about Hong Kong filmmakers fortunately featured the same information. In Teo's 2007 book, Johnnie To and the Hong Kong Action Film, he says, Wong shot the whole of Fallen Angels with a 9.8mm wide-angle lens. The book, like the thesis, only mentions focal length numerically once, again in regards to Fallen Angels, claiming, somewhat confusingly, that Doyle and Wong shot the entire film with a 9.8mm lens, something, as far as I could tell, is absolutely not correct. While much of Fallen Angels is shot on an ultra-wide-angle lens, the film features a number of shots, like these, clearly made with longer lenses. Even though the claim the book was making was absurd, at least this time it was sourced. Following the bibliography led me, finally, to my second actual primary source, a book of interviews with Wong Kar Wai. However, in the interview in question, originally published in the Hong Kong film magazine City Entertainment, far from claiming that the entire film had been shot on a 9.8mm lens, Wong comments instead that they had used the focal length as their standard lens during filming for its extreme distancing effect, saying that it made, quote, the distance between characters look far, but in fact, the characters are very close. Once again, I'd gotten to the bottom of that claim, but it didn't really answer my question. I already knew that a Kinoptik 9.8 was on set from the earlier interview with Christopher Doyle, and it's definitely possible it was used for at least some of the wide shots throughout the film, but I still couldn't answer definitively whether that was as wide as they went, or if that standard was just where they started. And on top of that, something about the conclusion just didn't feel right. The 9.8mm is a very wide lens, but comparing some of the shots from Fallen Angels to others in films using that lens, the perspective in Fallen Angels still seemed somehow more extreme to me. And on top of that, I still couldn't shake the mentions of other lenses in that original interview. I tried going back and searching writings about the film for other vintage ultra-wides, like the 8, 8.5, 9.5, and 10mm lenses made by Panavision and Lomo, as well as pouring back through old search results looking for something I might have missed, with no luck on either front. It was one thing to hunt down focal lengths I'd actually seen referenced before, but now I was completely in the dark. So I did what any good sleuth would do at this point, and I took a wild swing for the fence. My thought was, if the 6.8mm lens cited in the Christopher Doyle interview could have been a mistake either by him or the publisher, could some of these sources talking about a 9.8mm lens be mixing things up in the same way, especially since Doyle had been so certain that they'd gone down further than that? So, I split the difference, and I did a blind, exhausted search for what seemed like the only possibility left, a 6.8mm lens. Immediately, I turned up a series of completely new hits. On the front page of results, I found another thesis and a film review, both referring to a previously unheard of 6.8mm lens used in shooting the film, and both citing in their bibliographies a book by film critic Peter Brunette. To my luck, this book was not only easy to find, but doubly confirmed the number for me. Its first mention quotes an interview with the French magazine Positif, saying, "The film was shot almost entirely with an extreme wide-angle lens mounted on a handheld camera. Christopher Doyle has explained that prior to Fallen Angels, the widest angle lens that was considered usable was 18mm, whereas here he had used an incredibly wide 6.8mm lens. Quote, with a 6.8, I can see my assistant standing next to me. It's so wide. The characters have to be very close because as soon as they get a little further away, they seem too far away." To my disappointment, this is one source I was not able to chase down and double-check myself, as Positif does not archive their old editions online. But for me, it's a slightly easier grant, considering the second source of the 6.8 number comes from an interview with Wong Kar Wai by Brunette himself. He says, "As we went to that noodle shop, it is so small, the only way you can shoot in it is with a wide-angle lens. But I felt that a wide-angle lens was quite ordinary, so I asked my cameraman, do we have an extra wide angle? Yes, he said, we have a 6.8, but that will make your actress look terrible. I said, let's try it." And with that quote, I'd completely exhausted not just my sources, but what I believe to be just about every reasonably available primary source on the matter. So, it was finally time to put together all the confusing threads to see if there was enough to figure out once and for all what lens helped give Fallen Angels its unique and affecting look. So after all this, what information did I have? Christopher Doyle and Wong Kar Wai agree that a 9.8mm lens, one which seems to have been, by appearance and availability, to have been the popular Kinoptik 9.8mm, was used during filming. In interviews, both insist that they stepped down from a wide lens, the 9.8mm, to something much wider in the 6mm range. Despite the oft-repeated quote from Doyle, there's no way it could be the 6.5mm lens. There is no evidence of such a cine lens that I can find, and the closest, the theorized Cine Nikkor 6.5mm, is at best a 16mm film lens, which would not have been used on a 35mm production like Fallen Angels. And the only other specific focal length I can find cited is 6.8mm, but that doesn't appear in any lists of vintage lenses either. So the question is, how do we get from that Kinoptik 9.8mm to a 6.8mm lens that doesn't seem to exist? The answer finally came to me in a link that I nearly glanced over at first, a PDF form from 2014 listing the lenses available to rent from a large German rental house. Right there, Century Tegea, that is the name of the Kinoptik 9.8mm lenses rehoused for cinema use, and right below it, a wide-angle attachment, bringing the 9.8mm lens down to exactly 6.8mm. Exactly what I was looking for. Wide-angle adapters are nothing new, but were more commonly seen back in the day for extending the range of fixed-lens camcorders, but professional versions are still around and have been for a long time. A quick search revealed an old info sheet confirming it. This whole time, I'd been searching for an extra wide lens that matched the Kinoptik 9.8, when in reality, it was the Kinoptik all along, just given a little boost through a wide-angle attachment. Such a simple answer that it managed to stay right under our noses for all these years. Though, like most films, Fallen Angels was shot using a variety of lenses, the film's famous ultra-wide shots were done using a Century Kinoptik 9.8mm T2.3 lens, and, at least in part, taken further using a 0.7x wide-angle adapter, effectively converting it down to a 6.8mm lens. And with all that out of the way, there's just one obvious question remaining. Is this really what made Fallen Angels Fallen Angels? Let me be clear really quick. One of the things that makes me most uncomfortable with filmmaking communities is the strange gear fetishism they have, as if shooting with the right lenses or the right film stock or whatever will automatically make up for anything your movie might be lacking. And if there's one thing I want to avoid with this video, it's leaving people with the impression that it was this one lens that made Fallen Angels what it is. From the editing, to the music, to its neon-soaked alleys and incisive portraits of loneliness in the big city, everything is working together to make the movie as special as it is. But that lens choice is an example of some of the little things that really fascinate me when it comes to movies and how they're made. I love those highly specific little details you might not think of, the tiny accidents and circumstances of fate that end up capturing my imagination and having a way stronger impact than you might otherwise think. That simple choice to go with a slightly wider angle with an add-on adapter makes it that much more personal and visceral and unique, and does a lot to give the movie such a strong sense of momentum and space. It just wouldn't have the same personality and wouldn't be the same movie any other way. 'Cause I'm cool.